Bread is everywhere, on kitchen tables, in grocery stores, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Most of us eat bread without thinking much about it. It's familiar, comforting, ordinary. And because it's so ordinary, we rarely stop to ask where it came from. But bread has one of the longest and most surprising stories of any food humans have ever eaten. Long before cities, long before farms, long before written language, there was bread. Not the soft white bread we know today, but something much simpler, something rough, dense, made from wild grains and fire. For thousands of years, bread was not a side dish. It was survival. It filled the stomach. It lasted longer than raw grain. It could be shared. And in many ways, it quietly changed the direction of human life. Today, bread feels small, just another item in the pantry. But for most of human history, bread meant the difference between hunger and fullness, between wandering and staying, between surviving and building a life. Every culture has its own version. Flatbreads, loaves, steamed breads, fired breads, different shapes, different grains, but the same idea: grain and water, heat and time. Bread didn't belong to kings. It belonged to everyone. It was eaten by farmers, by travelers, by children, by elders. It was carried on long journeys, broken at shared tables, used as food, and sometimes even as a plate. Bread has always been close to daily life, close to work, close to family, close to the rhythm of the day. And yet, its beginning was not planned. It wasn't invented in a palace or designed by experts. Bread began quietly, accidentally, at a time when humans were still learning how to live on the land. In the next part of this story, we'll go back to that moment, to a time before farming, to a simple mistake near a fire that would change everything. To understand why bread mattered so much, we need to imagine a world without it. For most of human history, people did not farm. They did not plant fields or store harvests for the year ahead. They lived as hunter-gatherers. Small groups moved across the land, following the seasons. They gathered wild plants, roots, berries, and seeds. They hunted animals when they could. Food was unpredictable. Some days there was plenty, other days there was not. Grains existed, but only in the wild. Early humans noticed them growing naturally in certain areas. Tall grasses with small seeds that could be collected by hand. These grains were hard to eat raw, so people crushed them. They used stones to grind the seeds into a coarse powder. This was slow, tiring work. The result was not flour like we know today. It was rough, uneven, gritty. To make it edible, they mixed this grain powder with water. The result was a thick paste, not appetizing by modern standards, but it provided energy. At this time, people were still constantly moving. They followed animals. They followed weather. They followed food. There were no permanent homes, no villages, no reason to stay in one place for long. Life required flexibility. Everything had to be carried or easily replaced. Meals were simple. Whatever could be found that day was eaten that day. There was little storage, little planning, little security. And yet, humans were observant. They watched the land closely. They noticed where plants grew best. They noticed which foods kept them full longer. They noticed patterns. Certain areas became familiar. Places with water, places with wild grain. Groups returned to these places again and again. Not to settle yet, just to survive. This was the world just before bread changed everything. A world of movement, uncertainty, adaptation. A world where food was necessary but fragile. And then, in one of these familiar places, near a fire, something unexpected happened. A simple mistake, a small accident, one that would quietly begin a new chapter in human history. No one planned to invent bread. There was no moment of intention, no recipe, no instruction. Bread began as an accident. Around 14,000 years ago, people were still living as hunter-gatherers. They gathered wild grains and crushed them into a rough powder. They mixed that powder with water to make it easier to eat. This thick grain paste was usually eaten as it was. But one day, near a fire, something went wrong. Or perhaps something went right. Some of that paste was dropped onto a hot stone. The heat was intense. The paste spread slightly and began to harden. It changed texture. It changed smell. Instead of being raw and gritty, it became warm and firm. The surface browned. The scent was unfamiliar, but inviting. Someone tasted it. It was different. It was easier to chew, easier to digest, more satisfying. That moment mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it worked. This new form of grain was filling. It could be picked up, carried, shared. It didn't spoil as quickly as raw paste, and it could be cooked again and again in the same way. Without realizing it, people had made the first bread. It was flat, dense, dark. Nothing like modern bread, but it offered something new. Reliability. For the first time, grain could be transformed into food that lasted. That small change had quiet consequences. People began returning to places where wild grain grew more often. They knew they could gather grain there. They knew they could make bread there. These places became familiar, not permanent yet, but important. Bread didn't require chasing animals. It didn't require luck. It required patience, fire, stone, time. Slowly, bread became part of daily life. It was made near fires, shared among groups, eaten at the end of long days. And something else began to change. Because bread was filling, people didn't need to move as often. They could stay longer in one place. They could return to the same locations, season after season. Bread didn't just feed the body. It changed behavior. It changed rhythm. It changed how people related to the land. All from a single accident. A dropped paste, a hot stone, a moment of attention. In the next part of the story, we'll see how this simple food did something even more surprising. How bread appeared before farming. And how it quietly encouraged humans to stay, to plant, and eventually to build civilizations. What makes the story of bread even more surprising is this. Bread did not come after farming. It came before it. For a long time, people assumed that humans learned to farm first, and then began making bread from the crops they grew. But archaeological discoveries have shown something very different. Evidence now suggests that people were making simple bread thousands of years before they planted fields or domesticated crops. These early humans were still gathering wild grains, returning again and again to places where these grasses grew naturally. Over time, they became very familiar with the land, with the seasons, and with the plants that reliably provided food. Bread made those places more important. When people discovered that grain could be turned into filling, portable food, those grain-rich areas became valuable. Groups began to return to the same locations more often, not just to pass through, but to stay a little longer each time. Staying longer changed things. When people remained in one place for extended periods, they began to notice patterns more clearly. They saw when plants sprouted, when seeds dropped, and how new growth followed old growth. They noticed that disturbed soil sometimes produced more grain the following season. At some point, likely without intention, seeds were dropped near campsites and fires. Some of those seeds grew, and when they did, people noticed. This was not farming as we think of it today. There were no planned fields or organized planting. But it was the beginning of a new relationship with the land. Bread encouraged patience. Instead of constantly moving, people could wait. Instead of chasing food, they could observe it. Grain did not run away. It returned every year. Slowly, the idea of staying became possible. Shelters became more durable. Tools became heavier and more specialized. Storage became useful. Life began to organize itself around seasons, rather than constant travel. Bread was not the only reason this happened, but it played an important role. It provided steady energy. It could be shared easily. It allowed groups to plan just a little further ahead than before. In this way, bread helped bridge two worlds: the world of wandering and the world of settlement, the world of following food and the world of growing it. Without bread, farming might not have seemed worth the effort. Without farming, bread might never have evolved beyond simple, flat cakes cooked on stone. Together, they changed the course of human history. And once people began to settle, bread's role only grew larger. It moved from a helpful discovery to a daily necessity, shaping not only what people ate, but how they lived together. In the next part of the story, we'll see how bread became central to communities, shared meals, and the earliest forms of everyday life. Once people began staying in one place for longer periods of time, bread quietly took on a new role in daily life. It was no longer just a helpful food made when needed. It became something reliable, something expected, something people planned their days around. As small settlements began to form, bread fit naturally into this new way of living. Grain could be gathered nearby, ground by hand, mixed with water, and cooked close to home. The process took time, but it was predictable, and that predictability mattered. Bread was made regularly, often every day, and it was shared. In these early communities, meals were not private events. Food was prepared near shared fires and eaten together. Bread was broken by hand, passed from person to person, and eaten alongside whatever else the day had provided. Because bread was filling and easy to divide, it worked well in group settings. Everyone could receive a portion. No special tools were needed. No one had to go without. Over time, bread became part of the rhythm of the settlement. Grinding grain, kneading dough, tending a fire, and waiting for bread to cook all followed a familiar sequence. These repeated actions gave structure to the day and helped turn temporary camps into lasting homes. Bread also changed how people related to one another. When food is shared daily, relationships deepen. People talk. They observe one another. They notice who is present and who is missing. Bread brought people together not only physically, but socially. In many early communities, bread was more than food. It was part of hospitality. Offering bread meant offering safety and welcome. Refusing bread could signal distance or conflict. Bread even shaped how people ate. It was often eaten slowly, torn into pieces, dipped into simple soups, or eaten alongside vegetables. Meals became moments of pause rather than quick refueling. As settlements grew, bread remained central. It required cooperation. Someone gathered grain, someone ground it, someone prepared the fire, someone watched the bread cook. These shared tasks reinforced the idea that survival was no longer individual, but collective. Bread did not belong to one person. It belonged to the group. And because bread was so closely tied to daily life, it became associated with care, routine, and continuity. Children grew up watching bread being made. Elders passed down methods and habits. Knowledge moved quietly from one generation to the next. In this way, bread helped turn groups of people into communities, not through laws or structures, but through repetition. Day after day, meal after meal, bread became a symbol of stability in a world that had once been defined by constant movement. And as communities grew more settled and organized, bread continued to evolve with them, taking new shapes and meanings, while remaining rooted in the same simple idea. In the next part of the story, we'll look at how this simple food spread across different regions of the world, adapting to local grains, climates, and traditions, while still carrying the same familiar role at the center of everyday life. As bread became a steady part of daily life, it did not remain in one place or take only one form. Instead, it traveled quietly with people as they moved, settled, and adapted to new environments, shaping itself around the grains, climates, and traditions of each region. Wherever humans lived, bread followed, changing just enough to fit local conditions, while keeping the same basic purpose. Grain and water, shaped by heat and time, remained at the heart of it. In dry regions, flatbreads became common because they cooked quickly and required little fuel. Dough could be pressed thin and placed directly on hot stones or simple ovens, producing bread that was easy to store and carry. These flatbreads became staples in areas across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia, where bread was eaten daily and shared at nearly every meal. In cooler regions, with access to more fuel and enclosed ovens, thicker loaves developed. Dough was allowed to rest longer, sometimes rising naturally, as wild yeasts in the air interacted with the grain. These breads took more time to make, but they also lasted longer, supporting households through colder seasons. In some cultures, bread was steamed rather than baked, producing softer textures that suited local cooking methods. In others, bread was dried and stored for long journeys, ensuring food was available, even when fresh ingredients were scarce. Despite these differences, the role of bread remained remarkably consistent. It was eaten alongside simple foods, used to scoop and dip, and shared among families and neighbors. Bread rarely stood alone. It was part of a larger meal, part of a larger moment. As trade routes expanded, bread ideas traveled even further. Techniques moved from one region to another as people exchanged not only goods, but habits and knowledge. A way of grinding grain here influenced baking there. A method of shaping dough spread quietly through contact and imitation. Bread adapted without losing its meaning. It remained a daily food, not a luxury. A food for work days and rest days alike. A food present at both ordinary meals and important gatherings. Across cultures, bread became tied to hospitality. Offering bread meant offering welcome. Sharing bread meant acknowledging connection. In many places, refusing bread was seen as a serious gesture, signaling distance or distrust. Over generations, these traditions settled into routine. Children learned how bread was made by watching. Elders passed down techniques without written instructions. Knowledge lived in hands and habits rather than books. Bread did not need explanation. It was understood. Although breads looked different across the world, their purpose stayed the same. They provided nourishment, structure to the day, and a reason to gather. And even as societies became more complex, bread remained close to everyday life, quietly linking people across regions and centuries through a shared practice that required no special tools, no formal training, and no great wealth. In the next section, we'll look at how bread changed again as societies grew more organized and refined, and how one particular transformation reshaped bread's appearance, meaning, and place at the table. As societies became more organized and technology slowly advanced, bread began to change in appearance as well as meaning. For most of human history, bread had been dark, dense, and made from whole grains that included every part of the seed. This was not a choice, but a necessity, shaped by simple tools and limited processing. Over time, however, people learned how to refine grain more thoroughly. Improved grinding stones, sieves, and milling techniques made it possible to separate finer flour from the heavier outer layers of the grain. What remained was lighter in color and softer in texture. This pale flour was harder to produce and required more effort, which meant it was not available to everyone at first. White bread became rare and valuable, often associated with wealth, status, and refinement. In many societies, eating white bread signaled that a person did not have to do physical labor and could afford the extra work required to make it. Meanwhile, darker breads remained the food of everyday life. Farmers, workers, and families continued to eat breads made from whole grains because they were filling, practical, and familiar. For a long time, the color of bread quietly reflected social divisions. As milling technology spread and became more efficient, white bread slowly moved from elite tables into ordinary homes. What had once been a symbol of privilege became widely available, especially in growing towns and cities. With this shift came a change in perception. Light, soft bread was increasingly seen as desirable, modern, and refined, while darker bread was sometimes viewed as old-fashioned or coarse. Appearance began to matter more than substance. Bread was no longer judged only by how well it sustained the body, but by how it looked, how soft it felt, and how closely it matched new cultural ideas of progress and comfort. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not happen the same way everywhere. Many regions continued to value traditional breads, maintaining older methods and flavors. But the overall trend was clear. Bread was becoming more processed, more uniform, and more disconnected from its original simplicity. Even so, bread never lost its central place at the table. Whether dark or white, flat or risen, it remained a daily presence in homes across the world. What changed was not its importance, but its meaning. Bread began to reflect choice rather than necessity, preference rather than survival. And as bread entered the modern age, this shift set the stage for new questions about tradition, nourishment, and what people truly wanted from the food they ate. In the final part of our story, we'll gently reflect on what bread has meant across time and what its long history can still teach us today. Without rules, without pressure, and without needing to change anything at all. When we look back at the long story of bread, what stands out most is not how much it changed, but how much it stayed the same. For thousands of years, bread has followed people quietly through daily life, adapting to new places and new tools without losing its basic purpose. It has been made in times of scarcity and abundance, during peace and hardship, in small homes and growing communities. Bread was never meant to impress. It was meant to sustain. Across history, people did not ask whether bread was perfect or fashionable. They asked whether it filled the stomach, whether it could be shared, and whether it helped carry them through another day. In that way, bread reflects a simpler relationship with food, one based on need, routine, and trust. Over time, choices expanded, new methods appeared, preferences shifted. Bread became softer, lighter, and more varied. And with those changes came both convenience and distance from its origins. Today, bread is no longer required for survival in the way it once was. It sits among many options, shaped by taste, habit, and culture. But its presence still carries echoes of its past. When bread appears on the table, it often signals comfort, familiarity, home. It reminds us of shared meals, of hands passing food from one person to another, of quiet moments at the start or end of the day. These meanings did not come from advertising or design. They came from thousands of years of repetition. Bread teaches us something simple through its history. Not everything needs to be dramatic to be important. Not everything needs to be new to be valuable. Sometimes, what lasts is what fits naturally into life. As people grew older in earlier times, bread remained part of their days, offering steady nourishment and familiarity. It did not promise youth or strength. It offered something quieter enough. That idea still matters, not as a rule and not as a demand, but as a reminder that food can support life gently, without excess or pressure. That choices can be made with awareness rather than urgency. Bread's story is not about what we should eat, but about how humans have always sought balance between effort and reward, simplicity and satisfaction. And that search continues. As we carry this long story forward, bread remains what it has always been, a companion to everyday life, shaped by time, place, and care. Not extraordinary, but enduring. When we look at how bread has been eaten across generations, one thing becomes clear. For most of history, bread was simple, dark, and made from whole grains. Not because people were trying to be healthy, but because that was what was available and nourishing enough to sustain daily life. These breads were dense, filling, and familiar, shaped by tradition rather than trends. They were eaten slowly, often alongside simple foods, and they supported people through long days of work and long lives lived close to family and community. Following that tradition today does not mean going backward or giving up modern comfort. It simply means remembering what bread once represented: steadiness, nourishment, and continuity. Many people find that darker, whole grain breads still offer that same sense of satisfaction, helping them feel full and supported without excess. But bread has always been about more than nutrition. It carries memory, recipes passed down quietly, methods learned by watching. The smell of bread baking in a familiar kitchen, a slice prepared the same way year after year. Bread connects generations not through instruction, but through habit. And every family has its own bread story. A loaf made a certain way, a meal shared at a certain time, a recipe remembered, even if it was never written down. If you have a bread story like that, or a family recipe that has been passed down, you're invited to share it. These stories matter because they remind us that food is not just something we eat, but something we carry forward. Bread has always done that, quietly, reliably, from one generation to the next. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you have family recipes and stories, please feel free to share below.